The tension in the lecture hall was palpable from the moment students filed in. Dr. Linda Markham, a renowned professor of advanced calculus at one of America's most prestigious universities, was known for two things: her mathematical brilliance and her increasingly apparent political agenda. That morning, however, something felt different. Instead of the usual complex equations scrawled across the whiteboard, a single phrase was written in bold letters: redefining academic priorities. The atmosphere was heavy as students exchanged uncertain glances, sensing that today's class would not be about calculus. Seated toward the back, dressed impeccably in a pressed black suit, was a tall, quiet young man who rarely drew attention to himself. Barron Trump. While most students knew his name, few had ever spoken to him. He was reserved, methodical, and by all accounts, brilliant. But today, as Dr. Markham launched into her lecture, it became clear that he was about to be thrust into the center of an unexpected confrontation. Dr. Markham strode across the front of the class with a confidence that bordered on aggression. "Mathematics," she began, her voice carrying an unmistakable edge, while important, must make room for more pressing social discussions. Several students shifted uncomfortably as she continued outlining a new, balanced curriculum, one that would integrate discussions of privilege and equity into mathematical education. Barron, his expression unreadable, slowly raised his hand. A flicker of irritation flashed across the professor's face. She had not expected to be challenged, certainly not today. She ignored him and pressed on. "In today's world," she continued, "we need to focus less on abstract theories and more on real-world applications of social justice." With a click of her remote, a slide appeared, not of calculus formulas, but of statistics on gender representation in STEM fields. The implication was clear. "Some of you," she said, her gaze pointedly drifting toward specific students, "might need to accept that your privileged position in this class doesn't necessarily reflect merit." Barron's hand remained raised, steady and patient, while the rest of the class sat in uneasy silence. Some students stole glances at him, then at each other, recognizing the not-so-subtle jab. A few nodded slightly, as if grateful that someone was willing to speak up. Yet Dr. Markham continued as if she hadn't noticed him. "For instance," she said, clicking to the next slide, "family connections and wealth can create artificial advantages in education." The message was unmistakable. Though she never named him directly, the entire room knew exactly who she was talking about. Again, eyes flickered toward Barron, but his expression remained composed, his hand still patiently raised. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the professor sighed in exaggerated exasperation. "Yes, Mr. Trump," she said, her tone laced with thinly veiled amusement. "Do you have something to contribute to our discussion about privilege and education?" The silence in the room grew heavier. Everyone knew about Barron's perfect test scores, his quiet dedication to his studies, the way he spent hours helping classmates in the library despite never seeking recognition. And now, as he slowly lowered his hand and straightened in his seat, nobody could have predicted what was about to unfold. Barron's voice was measured and respectful when he finally spoke. "Dr. Markham," he said evenly, "I believe calculus is fundamental to understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this advanced class specifically to deepen our mathematical knowledge." He paused briefly, his gaze calm. "Wouldn't reducing the core curriculum disadvantage all students, regardless of their background?" A ripple of approval spread across the room, subtle but undeniable. Several students nodded. Others leaned in, sensing a shift in the conversation. But Dr. Markham's expression hardened. "Mr. Trump," she said, emphasizing his last name in a way that made the intent behind it clear, "perhaps you could benefit most from understanding how privilege shapes our educational system. After all, not everyone had private tutors and elite prep schools." The implication hung in the air. A few students grimaced. Others braced themselves, expecting a defensive response. But instead of reacting with indignation, Barron did something unexpected. He smiled. It wasn't mocking, nor was it bitter. It was the smile of someone who saw the trap being laid for him and refused to walk into it. "You're right about one thing, Professor," Barron said smoothly. "I have been fortunate in my education. That's precisely why I believe we have a responsibility to maintain high academic standards, so that everyone, regardless of background, can reach their full potential. The professor's face flushed slightly. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. And you think you know better than your professor about maintaining academic standards? She challenged, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Tell me, Mr. Trump, what makes you such an expert on mathematical education? I'm not claiming to be an expert, Barron replied, his tone still infuriatingly calm. I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes in its power to transcend political divisions. He gestured toward the whiteboard, which still lacked any actual calculus equations. Instead of debating privilege, couldn't we spend this time exploring the beautiful complexities of calculus? The class held its breath. The tension that had been simmering since the start of the lecture had now reached a boiling point. Some students who had initially remained neutral were now openly supporting Barron's point. Dr. Markham's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. She had intended to make an example out of Barron Trump, to use him as a symbol of the very privilege she was condemning. But in a matter of minutes, he had turned the conversation on its head. A slow smile curled on her lips, but it was not one of amusement. It was one of challenge. Very well, Mr. Trump, she said, moving toward the board. Since you're so passionate about mathematics, let's put that passion to the test. And with that, she picked up a marker and began writing. Line after line, an impossibly complex equation sprawled across the board, each symbol and function more intimidating than the last. Several students gasped softly, recognizing that this wasn't just an advanced calculus problem. It was one designed to humiliate. She stepped back, smirking. Since you're so concerned about maintaining academic rigor, she said, crossing her arms, why don't you show us how it's done? Unless, of course, you'd prefer to discuss your privileged background instead. The challenge hung in the air. Students exchanged glances, some whispering to each other. A few had already pulled out their phones, sensing that whatever happened next would be worth recording. But Barron? He simply stood, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked to the front of the class. Of course, he said quietly. I'd be happy to try. And with that, what had started as an attempt to embarrass Barron Trump was about to become something else entirely, something no one in that room would ever forget. Barron Trump stepped forward with quiet confidence, his expression unwavering as he approached the whiteboard. The equation before him sprawled across the surface, an intricate, multivariable calculus problem that most students in the room wouldn't even know where to begin solving. Some recognized elements of series expansion, others saw the hints of complex integration, but all could see that Dr. Markham had chosen it deliberately. This was not a test of knowledge. It was a trap. A challenge meant to humiliate, not to educate. The professor stood back, arms crossed, smirking slightly, waiting for Barron to hesitate, to falter, to confirm her implicit claim that his academic achievements were not a product of merit but of privilege. But as Barron studied the problem, something remarkable happened. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned to the professor, his tone even and composed. Before I begin, he said, I notice this problem has multiple possible approaches. Would you prefer I use the standard method, or would you be interested in seeing a more efficient solution I learned while studying Leibniz's original papers? The room went silent. A few students exchanged glances, and even those who had initially been indifferent to the confrontation felt the air shift. Dr. Markham's smirk faltered, just for a second. You've read Leibniz's original papers? She asked, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief. Yes, Barron replied simply, in German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology. The stillness in the room deepened. The tension that had previously been directed at Barron, the expectation of his failure, began to shift toward Dr. Markham. He had turned her challenge into something entirely different. He had made it about mathematics, about knowledge, about learning, rather than about power. Suddenly, she wasn't the one evaluating him. He was evaluating her. The class leaned in as Barron picked up the marker, his movements deliberate but unhurried. Let's let the mathematics speak for itself, he said, and then he began writing. His strokes were precise, his approach methodical. This first step, he explained, his voice steady, uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. His hand moved smoothly across the board as he broke down the problem, simplifying what had first appeared overwhelming. The students sat in stunned silence, watching as Barron not only solved the equation, but taught it, pausing occasionally to ensure everyone was following along. This wasn't just about getting the right answer. He was demonstrating a mastery that went beyond memorization. He was breaking down the concepts, making them accessible, making them clear. Dr. Markham's expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else beneath her forced composure. Uncertainty. She had planned to expose Barron as a fraud, as a beneficiary of wealth and nepotism. But instead, she was watching as he commanded the room with nothing but knowledge and logic. Some students had already begun taking notes, others whispering excitedly to one another. A few had even pulled out their phones to record, recognizing that something extraordinary was unfolding before them. Barron reached a crucial point in the solution and paused, turning to Dr. Markham with an almost disarming sincerity. "We have two paths forward," he said. "The traditional method would take another full board to complete, but there's a more elegant approach, using Leibniz's original insights. Which would you prefer to see, Professor?" The room held its breath. The question wasn't just about math. It was about whether Dr. Markham could acknowledge the brilliance unfolding in front of her, whether she could set aside her biases and engage with the subject on its own merits. But before she could respond, a hand shot up from the middle of the class. "Could we see both?" asked Sarah Chen, one of the quieter students who had never before spoken up in class. "This is actually helping me understand the chapter we covered last week better." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Other students nodded, some even leaning forward eagerly, no longer interested in the ideological battle, but in the sheer joy of learning. Barron smiled, nodding at Sarah before turning back to Dr. Markham. "What do you think, Professor?" he asked, extending her an opportunity to reframe the moment, to take part in a genuine educational exchange rather than a power struggle. Markham hesitated. She had lost control of the narrative. This was supposed to be about privilege, about inequality, about exposing an undeserving student who had coasted on his last name. But now she was standing in front of a classroom that was engaged, inspired, eager to learn, all because of the student she had sought to diminish. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, the classroom door burst open. Dean Richardson, a staunch ally of Dr. Markham's political activism, strode in with urgency. "Linda," he announced, his voice carrying an air of authority, "we need you for an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes." The timing couldn't have been worse for Dr. Markham, or better, as she thought to herself. She saw an escape, a way out of the situation that was slipping further and further from her control. "We'll have to continue this demonstration another time," she said hastily, already moving toward the door. But before she could take another step, Barron spoke again, his voice calm yet firm. "Professor, you challenge me to solve this problem in front of everyone," he said. Talking away now would teach an unfortunate lesson about academic integrity. A murmur spread through the room, students exchanging knowing looks, a few shaking their heads. The dean's face reddened slightly, sensing that this was no longer just a classroom dispute, but something much bigger. "Young man," he began, his tone dismissive, "are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir," Barron interrupted politely but decisively. "I'm stating a fact. Dr. Markham issued a public challenge to prove a point about privilege and merit. I accepted. The only question is, will she honor her own challenge?" The room fell into absolute silence. Several students had their phones out, recording, recognizing that they were witnessing something historic. Dr. Markham looked at the marker in her hand, at the board where Barron had effortlessly unraveled a problem she had assumed would stump him. She glanced at the dean, at the waiting crowd of students, at the undeniable reality of what had unfolded. Then, in a move that stunned even her most ardent supporters, she sighed, straightened her posture, and did something no one expected. She nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Trump," she said quietly, gesturing for him to continue. The dean looked shocked, but the moment had already taken on a life of its own. Barron turned back to the board, and with the same steady precision, he continued solving the problem, explaining each step as he went, turning what had begun as an attempt to humiliate him into an extraordinary moment of learning. And as the last equation was completed, as the final numbers fell into place, the classroom erupted, not in argument, not in division, but in applause. Because in that moment, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about privilege. It was about knowledge. It was about truth. And Barron Trump had just proved that no amount of bias, no attempt to diminish him, could ever erase the power of pure, undeniable intellect. Barron Trump stood at the front of the lecture hall, his gaze steady as he studied the complex equation that sprawled across the whiteboard. The problem was not just difficult. It was beyond the scope of anything taught in their advanced calculus course. It required knowledge of multivariable integration, series expansion, and mathematical techniques typically reserved for graduate-level study. The challenge was clear. Dr. Markham had not presented this equation as a learning opportunity, but as a calculated attempt at public humiliation. She expected him to falter, to hesitate, to expose himself as nothing more than the product of privilege rather than raw intellect. But as Barron examined the problem, his composure remained unshaken. Instead of appearing overwhelmed, he seemed intrigued. The professor, still standing with arms crossed, watched him closely, waiting for the moment of failure she was certain would come. The class, meanwhile, sat in hushed anticipation, eyes darting between Barron and the board, unsure of what was about to unfold. Then, in a voice calm and controlled, Barron turned slightly toward Dr. Markham and posed a question that caught everyone off guard. Would you prefer I solve this using the conventional approach, or would you like me to demonstrate an alternate method inspired by Leibniz's original writings? The air in the room shifted. A few students exchanged bewildered glances, and others leaned in, their curiosity piqued. The professor's smirk flickered ever so slightly. "You're familiar with Leibniz's original writings?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of skepticism. "Yes," Barron answered without hesitation. "I read them in German. The English translations don't always capture the full nuance of his techniques." A stunned silence followed. This was not the answer Dr. Markham had been expecting. Without waiting for further approval, Barron lifted the marker and began to write. His movements were fluid, deliberate, precise. "We begin by recognizing that this equation can be reframed using Euler's identity," he explained as he sketched out the first step of the solution. The students watched in astonishment as he effortlessly navigated the complexities of the problem, referencing historical mathematical principles with ease. This first step, he continued, was developed by Euler in 1755 to simplify multivariable integration. He worked through the equation with an elegance that was almost hypnotic, each line of his solution more efficient than the last. It was clear he was not just solving the problem, he was teaching it, breaking down each step in a way that even students who struggled with calculus could understand. The further he went, the more evident it became that Dr. Markham had made a serious miscalculation. She had expected Barron to struggle, but instead, he was demonstrating a level of mathematical mastery that left even the brightest students in the room spellbound. His ability to explain complex concepts with clarity made it impossible to dismiss him as merely someone with good test scores. This was genuine brilliance on display. Even students who had initially been indifferent to the classroom dynamic now found themselves captivated, some hastily scribbling notes, others recording the moment on their phones. Barron wasn't just solving the problem. He was elevating the discussion beyond what any of them had anticipated. Halfway through, he paused and turned to Dr. Markham. "At this point," he said evenly, "we have two viable paths forward. One follows the conventional method, requiring another board's worth of calculations, while the other applies a technique based on Leibniz's unpublished work. Which would you prefer?" The question wasn't just about mathematics. It was a direct challenge to the professor's authority, but delivered with such politeness and sincerity that it left her momentarily speechless. Silence. "Actually," said Peter easily. The class held its breath, waiting for her response. Before she could speak, a voice from the middle of the room cut through the silence. "Could we see both?" It was Sarah Chin, a student who rarely spoke in class. Her expression was earnest, her curiosity genuine. "This is actually making sense for the first time," she admitted. Barron nodded without hesitation. "Of course," he said, offering a small, reassuring smile. He continued, seamlessly demonstrating both approaches, explaining the advantages and limitations of each. What had started as an attempt to embarrass him had transformed into an impromptu masterclass, one that even Dr. Markham, despite herself, couldn't dismiss. She watched in stunned silence as he completed the solution in two different ways, the final answer appearing with a smooth flourish. The moment he capped the marker and stepped back, the room erupted. Applause, murmurs of astonishment, students exchanging excited whispers. It was clear to everyone in that room that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Dr. Markham, however, remained frozen. Her carefully constructed narrative had crumbled before her eyes. She had set out to expose Barron Trump, to prove that privilege and connections had placed him in this classroom, rather than talent or hard work. But instead, she had unwittingly given him the platform to prove, beyond any doubt, that his intellect was undeniable. And as the applause continued, as students turned to him with admiration rather than resentment, she realized that no amount of political framing could undo what had just happened. Barron Trump had not just met her challenge, he had surpassed it with an ease that left everyone, including herself, in awe. The moment Barron Trump capped the marker and stepped back from the board, the room hung in stunned silence. The problem Dr. Markham had chosen to humiliate him had instead become his stage, and he had just delivered a mathematical masterclass that left no room for doubt. He was not only capable, but extraordinary. His solution was more than just correct. It was elegant, efficient, and above all, educational. He had turned what was meant to be a moment of public embarrassment into a teaching opportunity, explaining each step with clarity, drawing from historical mathematical principles, and ensuring that even the struggling students in the room could follow along. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was genuine. Students who had entered the lecture hall indifferent to the unfolding confrontation were now fully engaged, some whispering to each other in excitement, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. But amidst the growing admiration, there was one person who had yet to speak. Dr. Markham, still standing with arms crossed, had watched the entire scene unfold, her expression unreadable. Just minutes ago, she had been certain of the outcome, that Barron, faced with a problem beyond the scope of the class, would stumble, proving her point about privilege and merit. Instead, she had found herself watching a demonstration that rivaled any she had seen from professional mathematicians. Her attempt to expose Barron as an unworthy beneficiary of wealth and status had completely backfired, revealing him instead as a prodigy, a student whose understanding of calculus surpassed even her own expectations. She had not prepared for this outcome, and for the first time since stepping into the lecture hall that morning, she had no idea what to say. Barron, however, remained poised. He didn't revel in the moment, didn't gloat or smirk at the professor's silence. Instead, he simply turned toward the class, addressing them directly. "What makes mathematics beautiful," he said, his voice steady but sincere, "is that it doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about privilege, background, or opinion. It only cares about truth." He gestured toward the board, where both his solutions remained untouched. The answer was always there. The only question was whether we were willing to find it. A ripple of agreement moved through the students, some nodding, others looking toward Dr. Markham to see how she would respond. The professor shifted slightly, as if breaking free from the weight of her own thoughts. She could feel the entire class waiting for her reaction, for her to either acknowledge what had just happened or attempt to regain control of the situation. The old instinct, the one driven by ideology rather than academia, urged her to dismiss Barron's achievement, to pivot the conversation back to her original narrative. But another part of her, the part that had once been a passionate mathematician before politics had clouded her purpose, recognized the reality of what she had just witnessed. Barron Trump had not just solved the problem, he had taught it in a way that reignited curiosity in a room full of students who had, until today, viewed calculus as a burden rather than an art. Before she could speak, another voice broke through the tension. "Professor," Sarah Chen said hesitantly, her voice carrying more weight than she likely realized. "Could we go over that second method again, the one using Leibniz's approach? I think I finally understand the concept we struggled with last week." More murmurs of agreement followed, and soon other students began voicing similar thoughts. "Yeah," one called out, "this actually makes sense now." "I thought I hated calculus," another admitted, "but I kind of want to see how that method applies to the next problem." The shift in the classroom was undeniable. What had started as an attempt to undermine Barron had instead sparked genuine engagement, a hunger to learn that had been absent before. Dr. Markham, still standing at the front of the room, felt the weight of their eyes on her. She could take this moment in one of two directions. She could double down, attempt to reassert control through some ideological argument, or she could embrace what had just happened and allow the classroom to become what it was always meant to be, a space for intellectual exploration. Slowly, she inhaled, then exhaled. "Very well," she said at last, her voice quieter than before. "Let's go over it again." She gestured toward Barron. "Would you like to walk us through it once more?" The murmurs in the room turned to something else entirely. Respect, perhaps even admiration. This was not the professor many of them had expected to see in this moment, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, a small smile played at the corner of Barron's lip. He nodded. "Of course," he said, picking up the marker once more. What followed in the next 40 minutes was nothing short of remarkable. Barron didn't just walk the class through the problem again, he expanded on it, exploring alternate methods, encouraging students to ask questions, breaking down concepts in ways that made even the most complicated techniques feel approachable. Dr. Markham, at first hesitant, eventually began adding to the discussion, engaging with Barron not as an opponent, but as a fellow academic, an equal. The barriers that had once separated them, preconceived notions, ideological biases, assumptions about privilege, began to dissolve in the presence of something far more powerful, the pursuit of knowledge. By the end of the lecture, students who had once dreaded calculus were staying behind, eager to continue the discussion. A few approached Barron, asking if he would be willing to organize additional study sessions. Dr. Markham, watching from a distance, felt something stir within her. Something she hadn't felt in years. Passion. Not for politics, not for pushing a narrative, but for teaching. For mathematics, for the reason she had once chosen this profession in the first place. And as she glanced toward Barron, who was patiently explaining another concept to a small group of students, she realized something even more profound. This was never about privilege. It was never about politics. It was about merit, about ability, about recognizing brilliance when it stood right in front of her. And today, in this classroom, she had been forced to confront a truth that not even ideology could deny. Barron Trump was not just a student, he was a genius. And more importantly, he had just reminded everyone, including herself, what education was truly meant to be. Dr. Markham stood motionless at the front of the lecture hall, her fingers still gripping the marker as if she could somehow rewind the last hour and undo the events that had just unfolded. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and for the first time in her career, she was at a loss. She had entered the class that day with full confidence in her ability to frame the discussion, to control the narrative, and to use Barron Trump as an example of unchecked privilege. Instead, she had been met with a level of intellect, poise, and humility that had shattered every assumption she had walked in with. She had expected arrogance, but had received grace. She had anticipated ignorance, but had been presented with mastery. And now, as she looked around the room, she realized she had lost something far more important than an ideological debate. She had lost the respect of her students. The silence was deafening. Students who had once regarded her with unquestioning authority now looked at her with something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even disappointment. And standing before her, still calm, still composed, was Barron Trump. He had every reason to humiliate her in return, to seize the moment and expose her for the bias she had so openly displayed. But he did no such thing. Instead, he extended an olive branch. "Professor," he said, his voice carrying no trace of resentment or triumph, "I meant what I said earlier. Your expertise in theoretical mathematics is valuable. and I've learned from your lectures. If you'd like, I'd be happy to help bridge the gap between theory and application for students who need it." His words hung in the air, an invitation rather than an ultimatum. For a long moment, Dr. Markham simply stared at him. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, the realization that she had tried to diminish someone who had only ever sought to contribute. Slowly, she exhaled, setting the marker down with a quiet click. I may have let my preconceptions get the better of me today," she admitted. Her voice remained silent, waiting, watching. Then she straightened her posture, meeting Barron's gaze. "But if you're willing to collaborate, then so am I." A quiet ripple of astonishment spread through the students, and then, in an unexpected turn, applause broke out. Not for Barron's victory, not for Dr. Markham's defeat, but for the transformation of the moment into something greater than either of them had anticipated. The days that followed the now famous confrontation in Dr. Markham's calculus class saw a shift that no one could have predicted. What had started as an attempt to humiliate Barron Trump had instead become a catalyst for something far more profound. A transformation in the culture of the classroom itself. Students who had once entered that lecture hall resigned to the idea that mathematics was just another battlefield for ideological posturing now found themselves eager to learn, inspired not just by Barron's brilliance, but by the realization that knowledge, true knowledge, transcends politics. Dr. Markham, to her credit, had taken the lesson to heart. After years of allowing personal bias to seep into her lectures, she found herself rediscovering the passion that had once driven her to academia in the first place. And it was Barron, the very student she had sought to diminish, who had unwittingly reignited that passion. She walked into class the next week to find something astonishing. Nearly double the usual number of students in attendance. Word had spread far beyond the walls of their lecture hall, and now students from other courses, some who had never even considered taking advanced calculus, had come just to witness what was happening. Dr. Markham could have resisted the change, could have tried to reinstate her former authority, but instead she chose to lean into it. "I assume many of you are here because of last week," she began, scanning the room. A few students chuckled nervously. "I won't pretend that was my finest moment," she admitted, "but I'd like to believe that education is about growth, not just for students, but for professors as well." She turned to Barron, who sat as always near the back, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Trump," she said, "since you seem to have a talent for explaining concepts in ways that engage your classmates, would you be willing to help lead some of today's discussion?" There was a moment of silence, not of discomfort, but of genuine curiosity. Students glanced toward Barron, wondering how he would respond. He could have been smug, could have taken the opportunity to assert dominance in a classroom that had once been hostile to him, but that was not who he was. He simply nodded. "I'd be happy to," he said. He stood, walked to the front of the room, and for the next hour something remarkable unfolded. He and Dr. Markham co-taught, moving seamlessly between theoretical concepts and their real-world applications. What had once been a room filled with skepticism and division was now a place of collaboration, curiosity, and, most importantly, respect. Even students who had once been indifferent to calculus found themselves engaged, asking questions not out of obligation but out of genuine interest. Those who had struggled with the material found that Barron's ability to break down complex problems into understandable steps made all the difference. The energy in the room was different, not weighed down by ideological tension, but lifted by the shared pursuit of knowledge, and Dr. Markham, for the first time in years, felt as though she was truly teaching, not dictating. By the end of the class, students who had previously felt disconnected from mathematics lingered behind, discussing problems with Barron and each other, their enthusiasm undeniable. Dr. Markham watched, and for the first time she saw her role as an educator in a new light. She had entered that classroom believing she was the authority, that her job was to shape minds in the way she saw fit, but now she understood that the true purpose of teaching was not to impose beliefs, but to foster a space where students could think, question, and discover for themselves. And in that realization, she found not defeat, but redemption. The transformation that began in Dr. Markham's calculus classroom did not stay confined within its walls. What had started as a tense ideological standoff had evolved into something far more profound, a shift in the way students approached learning itself. The story of Barron Trump's quiet yet undeniable mastery over the most complex mathematical concepts spread rapidly, not just among students in the university but across academic circles beyond. What made the moment so impactful was not merely his ability to solve an impossibly difficult problem, but the way he had done so. With humility, patience, and a genuine love for the subject. He had not sought to humiliate his professor in return for her attempts to diminish him. Instead, he had chosen the higher path, proving that true intelligence was not about proving others wrong, but about elevating the conversation to something greater. And in doing so, he had not only won over his classmates, but had also sparked a much-needed conversation about what education was truly meant to be. As weeks passed, something remarkable happened. Attendance in Dr. Markham's class continued to grow. Students who had never considered themselves mathematically inclined now found themselves drawn to the lectures, not because they suddenly saw themselves as future mathematicians, but because they wanted to be part of an environment where ideas were explored openly, where knowledge was valued for its own sake, rather than as a vehicle for ideological agendas. The energy in the room had shifted completely. Where there had once been passive learning, now there was engagement. Where there had once been an unspoken divide between students based on their backgrounds or political leanings, now there was collaboration, and at the heart of it all was the student who had once been expected to fail. Barron Trump, whose quiet demeanor and relentless pursuit of knowledge had become an unexpected source of inspiration. But the impact extended beyond just the students. Dr. Markham, a professor who had once seen her classroom as a battleground for shaping ideology, found herself rekindling her original passion for mathematics. For years, she had used her position to push a worldview, assuming that shaping minds meant molding them into her preferred vision of the world. But Barron's performance that day had shaken something within her, forcing her to confront a truth she had long buried. Education was not about control. It was about discovery. It was about allowing students to think freely, to challenge ideas, and to arrive at conclusions based on merit rather than persuasion. And perhaps most humbling of all, she realized that even professors had more to learn. Despite the attention the event had received, Barron himself remained unchanged. He continued to sit in the back of the classroom, still dressed in his pressed black suits, still offering quiet assistance to struggling students who sought him out. He never once reveled in the reputation he had gained, nor did he see himself as the victor of some ideological war. For him, none of it had ever been about proving a point. It had always been about the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. And that, more than anything, was what made his impact so lasting. Students who had once been intimidated by calculus now found themselves excited to tackle new problems. Conversations that had once revolved around identity, politics, and social theories now focused on real-world applications of mathematics, engineering, and science. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Learning had taken center stage again, unburdened by the weight of external agendas. As time went on, even the university administration took notice. The dean, who had once burst into that classroom in an attempt to shut down the moment, found himself reconsidering the role of ideological narratives in academic spaces. Other professors, many of whom had once treated STEM education as secondary to broader cultural discussions, began to reflect on whether they had lost sight of their purpose. And most importantly, students who had long felt disconnected from the educational process now saw a reason to invest in it again. The lesson they had learned from Barron was not just about mathematics. It was about the power of intellectual independence, the importance of questioning assumptions, and the understanding that true knowledge is never dictated but discovered. In the final weeks of the semester, something unprecedented happened. Dr. Markham, the very professor who had once sought to undermine Barron, personally invited him to lead an advanced discussion on real-world applications of calculus. It was a full-circle moment, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had brought them both to this point. And when Barron took the stage, standing at the front of the room instead of in the back for the first time, he didn't use the moment for self-congratulation. Instead, he simply picked up the marker, turned to the board, and asked the same question that had once silenced his own professor. Would you like to see the conventional method, or a more elegant solution? The room erupted in smiles, knowing glances exchanged between students who had witnessed the transformation firsthand. The class that had once been divided by political undercurrents was now united in something far greater: the pursuit of knowledge, untainted by external biases. The impact of that day did not fade, nor was it confined to a single university. It served as a reminder that education, at its best, is about curiosity, about exploration, about a relentless desire to seek truth. And in that moment, as Barron seamlessly walked his classmates through a problem far beyond their course level, one truth became undeniable. He had not only changed the culture of that classroom, but he had set a new standard for what learning could and should be. The story of Barron Trump's experience in Dr. Markham's classroom carries a powerful lesson that extends far beyond the walls of academia. It is a reminder that knowledge, integrity, and humility will always triumph over bias and preconceived notions. For many older Americans who have witnessed the cultural and educational shifts over the decades, this story reaffirms an essential truth. Education should be about the pursuit of wisdom, not the imposition of ideology. Barron's response to adversity teaches us that true strength is not found in loud arguments or personal attacks, but in quiet confidence and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Instead of reacting with anger or resentment when challenged, he chose to let his intellect and character speak for themselves, demonstrating that merit and perseverance will always be more powerful than labels and assumptions. This lesson is one that resonates deeply, particularly in an era where societal divisions often overshadow the fundamental values that once united us: hard work, respect for learning, and the belief that every individual should be judged on their abilities rather than their background. It reminds us that dignity comes not from proving others wrong, but from standing firm in our values and leading by example. In life, as in Barron's case, the best response to those who underestimate us is not to engage in conflict, but to continue excelling, inspiring, and proving through action that true ability cannot be denied.